Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Venture Stories podcast. I'm Dwane, and with us today is our brand new partner at Village Global, Prateek Alsi. And Prateek goes way back with today's guest. So Prateek will make today's introduction.
So, Anne, thanks so much, and great to be at Village. It's sort of my pleasure today to welcome a guest to our podcast. Hemant is managing partner at General Catalyst, someone I know very well. I worked with him very closely in the early days of the office there in San Francisco and Palo Alto. But he started the Palo Alto office in 2011. And, he's one of the best investors, I would say, out there. Companies like Stripe, Snapchat, Gusto, Livongo, Samsara, Anduril, Applied Intuition. I can keep going, but know them very well. He's also a graduate of MIT with 5 degrees. So lots of amazing things on his credential list. But I think today we're here to talk about his new book.
Perfect. Hemant, your new book is Intended Consequences, How to Build Market-Leading Companies with Responsible Innovation. Can you unpack for us what is responsible innovation?
First of all, thanks for having me, Anne, and congrats, Prateek. I think we're going to be working together in a different format now, so looking forward to it. Responsible innovation for us at a very fundamental level is really mindset and mechanisms with which we should be building companies today. And it's based on the simple observation that, tech has gone from, at least when I got into business 20 years ago, an efficiency enabler for us as human beings, as employees of companies or as consumers, to really redefining all core pillars of society. Right? We've gone from building software for doctors and teachers and supply chain managers and white collar workers and blue collar workers to, building banks and schools and hospitals and insurance companies and defense companies. And that's a lot of responsibility. And I think the whole point is to put that responsibility in spotlight for us as all the stakeholders and think about building companies that are fundamentally in the interest of society. And I don't want to come across as a impact investor when I say that. I'm, a capitalist at heart. I just deeply believe that unless you build with that intentionality, you're not going to build companies that can compound for a long time, which is the hallmark of the best investments. So, I think it's a mindset that we as the technology diaspora, all of us need to embrace. And that's what we talk about in the book.
Great. And you specifically dig in on 2 pillars of that mindset. Can you talk a little bit about durability?
As I was saying, look, our mission at GC, and Prateek knows this, we didn't have proper mission, vision, and values when he was there. But, as we decided over the last 3-4 years that we ourselves want to be an enduring organization, what's the first thing you do if you want to build a foundational company? You think about your culture, your values. So we, wrote this mission statement, which is to invest in positive, powerful change that endures. And again, it's based on the core belief that the very best investments are the ones that are made in companies that can be around for a long time. And when you're building banks and schools and insurance companies, to my earlier point, you will only be around for a long time if you're the interest of society. And so durability comes from embracing responsibility.
And it seems like unintended consequences can be really hard to anticipate. How do you advise founders to identify them?
Yeah. Look, unintended consequences, they're called unintended consequences for a reason. We don't anticipate them. We don't plan for them. I think the belief that we have is we can minimize them. And that's the whole point behind intended consequences. If you, think a lot about why first as founders you're building a company, what's the core change you want to create in the world? If you think a lot about then translating that into product for your customers, but then also measuring the impact of that product on other stakeholders. If you think a lot about, are you making business model choices that are aligned? We have 2 major industries where we have misaligned business models, advertising and healthcare. Who pays and who decides are 2 different stakeholders, and it's a mess, right? And we're unwinding that in both of these areas. So business models one, how do you think about your impact on sustainability on the planet? I think the debate that is there a climate change, I believe is over for good, and we now need to figure out what to do about it. Hopefully it's over for good. And so, the point is, if you think about all these questions, if you plan for these questions as much as possible, if you build a team that has the diverse points of views around the table to answer those questions in an optimal fashion, you will minimize unintended consequences.
Yeah. And if I could maybe ask sort of, to Hemant to follow up on that thread a bit, we invest Village in the earliest stages, pre-seed, seed. How should sort of a entrepreneur or founder think about like some of this at the earliest stages? And how does one think about frameworks to use, for this?
So look, I think when you start operationalizing a lot of what I'm saying, so it's not just motherhood and apple pie, it becomes really hard, right? Because now it becomes the trade-offs between short-term and long-term decisions. And what I would say is you really do have to think through the overall change you're trying to create in the world, and thinking through, so what are the core values? Who are the stakeholders? As long as you first and foremost have the right mindset, you have thought through those questions. I mean, I wrote a paper, I think it was a few years ago, The Era of Move Fast and Break Things is Over, where we try to lay out and say, look, here's some questions to think about. First thing is to think about those questions, right? Then it's about, building a team that is aligned with that set of values and is going to sort of deconstruct those questions into product development and business model choices and different, your marketing and messaging and partnerships and so on. And then I think in that sort of hazy moment when it's not clear due to the short-term decision or the long-term decisions, you do have to reflect back on those values and see if the short-term is taking you away from the long-term. And that's the hard places where you have to say no, right? I think this is what separates, to me, great long-term thinking, disciplined entrepreneurs from folks that are looking for hacks. The era of we want to be a hacker entrepreneur because it was just feature engineering and social media optimization is over. Like, we need to be empathetic entrepreneurs. So like, we have to think about those choices a lot more intentionally.
And Hemant, as another follow-up to that, I think you guys have recently launched this Responsible Innovation Lab, with one of our friends. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of the thinking behind that area and some of the work maybe even that you've done on one of the most recent crises, which is the Russia-Ukraine situation?
We put together Responsible Innovation Lab as a nonprofit. We did it with two good friends, John Ziegler, who was the general counsel at Stripe, and Dita Van Lamone, who built international for Stripe and then also co-founded Premier with us at GC. So they're long-term collaborators and friends. And honestly, the idea has been to create a place where we can all contribute our playbooks of what's worked towards this whole notion of creating intended consequences. We don't have all the answers, neither at GC nor at RIL, but it was important to say, let's convene this effort and start creating a growing body that's learning together in the Valley. And, we launched it at the end of the year. We're soon going to be coming out with our charter, which a lot of folks have helped us review and iterate. And the idea is to create a movement so that if we can highlight and celebrate the good choices founders have made and the good outcomes that has created for the world, as opposed to only sort of learning from what hasn't worked, and codifying that into playbooks for the next generation of founders. I think that's really our goal is pay it forward with that sort of construction of that body of work.
Yeah, I think actionable guidance is amazing for the CEOs and operators and even investors. So I think we need some of that help too in terms of how to think about it. So,
can you give us some specific examples of mechanisms that you've seen founders create within companies to kind of make sure that they're moving beyond intention?
Yeah, I'll give you one live one that Prateek also knows well. A lot of the work that Class Dojo does in the education space, right? And they are essentially organizing parents, teachers, and kids online, and all around creating the social fabric for developing them beyond just their academic learnings. And there's this whole sort of evolution of our online interactions to be a lot more interactive. Some call it metaverse, others have other words for it. And the reality is that we and therefore our kids also are spending a lot more time online. And how should that be done? Right? I mean, what are the sort of core principles with which you would do it. That's an example of what you would think about. Another example I'll give you in the healthcare sector, where I spend a lot of time, there was this effort created by big companies called Haven, with the observation that healthcare is messed up. There's a lot of waste, and employers feel like they're not getting great care for their employees. So the conclusion they made was, why don't we create a narrow network of providers that serves our employees and does it optimally? The unintended consequence, if that was actually successful, would have been, like what most folks don't know, is a lot of the profit pools for hospitals is their relationship with the employers. And then they use those profit pools to then subsidize Medicare and Medicaid populations. So if you took those profit pools away from businesses, or a lot of these are actually nonprofits that are barely viable, you would literally make them go bankrupt. So how is that a solution that's going to be, in the end, something that can endure? So I think sort of thinking through how do you really take care of all the stakeholders in these important markets is a lot of where those mechanisms have to take hold.
One of the topics you've talked a little bit about is unengagement in healthcare. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Disengagement was the word that I came up with in a working session. Just when we were building Livongo, and we were drawing up, we had this product whiteboarding session, and we were talking about, we're going to build this software along with the service we're building for the consumers with diabetes. And the idea, somebody had proposed that, and we got to get people into that app as much as possible. And we were like, well, who wants to think about their diabetes, even once a day? And we need to think about our disengagement principle. So while there's a lot to learn from advances in technology and social media on digital engagement, like from first principles, that's not what you would think about in terms of healthcare. And you actually want to disengage them from there. In fact, in my book on healthcare, the very first sentence is that in an ideal world, there would be no healthcare because everybody would be healthy. That's what people actually want. Yeah, Prateek's pointing that on the screen. And so, that mindset and sort of being first principled about what the relationship of consumers and technology should be in every industry is very important. And I think this is actually the reason why I'm a big believer that as technology goes mainstream, we should all indict the word disruption and really think about radical collaboration with the stakeholders in these industries and figure out what's the ideal experiences we want to create for different segments.
And you've co-founded multiple companies, Commure and Livongo. Take us behind the curtain a little bit. What are some of those early discussions like?
The creation process, we have a whole fund that's called the Creation Fund, because we've really tried to institutionalize this act of company building for a variety of reasons. It's a great business for us, but it also makes us player coaches, gives us empathy for what all the founders go through. The start of these are all actually pretty unique. It probably always has a couple of criteria. One is, there's a core insight that's nagging at us as to something that isn't naturally happening in the founder community, that we aren't just automatically tackling. And there's reasons for that. Sometimes it's because it is so multidisciplinary that the right skill sets haven't come together. Sometimes it's very capital intense. Sometimes it's just a complex market to navigate, and you need the real relationships and ecosystem to power through it. And if we've convinced ourselves that this is one of those areas where, by being a catalyst, pun intended, we can actually make a difference in that industry, we will take it on. And we will take it on in partnership with, as I mentioned, Dita was my partner in Commure, Glenn Tolman when we did Livongo, Paul English and Steve Hafner when my partner Joel did Kayak. So it was it really is kind of bridging these different worlds together and, catalyzing these sort of, in our opinion, what end up being interesting category defining companies.
And you, as you mentioned, worked a lot in heavily regulated, kind of entrenched industries, right? Healthcare, education, climate. What makes you optimistic these days?
I went into these markets. This was, Prateek will probably remember this, sort of early 2010s. Because I was very convinced that you couldn't build interesting businesses on top of the social platforms, that they were just going to extract too much rent. And so I looked for places where I felt like they did not have an unfair advantage. And healthcare, luckily, so messed up, nobody has any unfair advantage. And obviously then you had defense and IoT and other areas. So that's what took me there. The reason I'm optimistic now is because there are a lot of great proof points of companies that are building, that are scaling. We were early investors in Duro in the defense area, Samsara, Relativity in the space side. And it's just remarkable what these companies are able to do, and how they're largely becoming engineering problems out of necessity, or the governments are much more open to saying we need to lean on the commercial sector for innovation. I think the world's changed for a while. In the very early days of tech, it was all innovation came out of the government sector, like BBN and ARPANET and so on. And then, for a while it was coming out of, consumer platforms. And I just think sort of a lot of the innovation is coming from the creation of these platforms today. And the government's getting more and more comfortable with leveraging that and sort of relying on these companies versus their traditional models. I think that's big. I also think, in healthcare, we don't have a choice. We're going bankrupt otherwise. In industrial, you can just build much better cost-effective experiences for those workforces. So it's all going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. We're lucky to be doing what we do in this era.
Hemant, you've also spent some time at sort of this intersection of technology and policy. And so how does sort of this world also play into some of these sectors that you've talked about, like defense and, space and others?
The core parts of the economy, the core parts of society are truly innovations at the intersection of technology, policy, and capital. And, we lived in the tech industry in this little bubble where none of that mattered to us and everybody left us alone for a while. Everything we do now touches policy and touches, needs lots and lots of capital because the ideas are so much bigger. And so, my belief is that the more we can bring the regulators along, and the more we can appreciate the spirit of what regulations were there for. They might be outdated, but I think the spirit of why they were created usually has some good in them. And then understanding that, implementing that in software, and then helping evolve what needs to evolve from a governance perspective, from regulatory, it almost has to become our responsibility, right? I mean, I think there was a lot of people mocking when Zuckerberg testified in Congress and people didn't know how the business model worked. It's great. We can mock it, that the regulators don't understand how tech businesses work, or we can be scared that, boy, we're building regulatory frameworks in our country without actually understanding how tech is, powering a large part of this economy. We got to fix that. We can't say they have to go fix it on there. We have to help. Yeah. And so I think that collaborative mindset is really important in terms of helping evolve policy, while protecting the spirit of the policies that existed.
And how does that sort of get even more complicated as, now you're a global firm, right? You have offices in Europe and India. Sort of, you saw the Coinbase stuff recently where they just got shut down because they didn't apparently talk to the policy folks as closely as they should have. How complex is that going to be for companies now as well, in your mind?
First of all, it's really fun because it's an opportunity to unlearn. We're doing some work in healthcare in India, and I'm like, nothing that I know in the US applies, which means nothing that I know in healthcare applies because all my learning is US based. Yeah. I do think you have to be first principled as you think about these types of areas in different markets. It is complex. Take the case of Livongo. There was always a question of should we go international? And I was always on the other side of that debate because I'm like, why? There's 35 million people to impact in the US. That's $35 billion of revenue. And by the time we sold, it was like 600-700, maybe. I maybe have the number wrong, but it's a few $100 million in revenue at that time. And so I was like, why do we want to go there? Let's really lean in and finish the job here, and we can build a massive business. So I think some of it is in these regulated markets being sort of rigorous about why and when to take on additional markets is an important question for founders. Mm-hmm. It's always a shiny penny, but it's a lot harder to go do, these in multiple markets. Look at Gusto. I mean, they have endless amount of business to do in the US. Should they really go take on another country? There are many other people building different Gustos in Europe, and I think it's fine. Josh and team have tons to do here. So first thing is that I think sort of being focused on when to do it and why. Crypto is an interesting place because it fundamentally denounces sovereignty and regulations, right? And it's all about saying you're on the net, and look, I don't quite know how, but it's going to have a place in the technology ecosystem. So I'm very curious how that happens. Like we invested in this company, CoinTracker, these phenomenal founders that are helping do your tax filings in crypto. And think about somebody like Intuit or whoever does your taxes. Nobody does these. No global company has been built there. But you might actually build that if you sort of leverage the crypto rails to go do that. So I do think it might be a shortcut to build global businesses on top of local regulatory frameworks, but a lot has to, that's a very long-term comment in what I'm saying there. So,
well, and in addition to working with regulators on some of this, you are also talking to some of the largest LPs, limited partners and investors and pools of capital in the world. How are they responding to your thesis?
They really support it. I mean, I actually had a call this morning with one of our endowment LPs, enduring organization, been around for a few hundred years. And I was reviewing our charter that I referenced earlier for responsible innovation. John and I and Raghavan from our team were doing this. And, they were proud of us for thinking this way. And they obviously have a lot of learnings that they want to share to help us sharpen the message, but then also think there's going to be a growing movement in the LP community to want to see this industry take on responsibility, more seriously in terms of what we do.
Yeah, I was going to say, so Ann and I just read MIT's letter that they sent out, their management company letter they sent out last month, and they talked a little bit sort of about this or hinted at it. But, one of the areas that people can be critical around is that this is ESG and this is just like another flavor of ESG. And how do we sort of think about that, or how do we sort of debunk that?
Yeah, look, I am not a huge fan of ESG, but not for the same reasons as Peter Thiel. I would say I think ESG is a bit of a focus on the outputs. And I just believe it's a little too late. It's well-intentioned, and I suppose we need some sort of a measurement framework. So I'm glad we're taking it seriously and learning from it. But in the end, I just think the biggest lever is like, let's build with responsible innovation. And ESG will, the metrics you want in ESG will just be the output for that. And if you believe, as a tech diaspora, we're going to build so much of the economy again in different verticals, then that's the fastest way to have that impact. Is like, why don't we just build that into the governance of how we build next generation companies and focus there, versus trying to hold responsible sort of businesses that are very set in their ways, have a lot of inertia. I think that's where gamesmanship and gamification to hit the scorecards is going to happen, because some of that is just insurmountable issues that they have. Mm-hmm. But our energy is very much on, as I said, sort of embracing responsible innovation across our portfolio and hopefully in the tech ecosystem, so that we as a byproduct improve environmental sustainability and governance objectives.
Are there things you think LPs could do to help other investors think about this more?
Yeah, I mean, I think listen, we have really smart people in our industry. They all think about it. They can actually probably articulate both sides of the debate. I think it's much more, can the LPs lean on them to take it more seriously? I think, as you said, some LPs are starting to do it, and I think more will as well. It's something that's increasingly going to become what consumers want in the products we sell them, and what LPs want in the returns we give them. And I do think it's a growing movement that, if you embrace it, can be a source of competitive advantage for your business.
And where talent will flow too, right, to these businesses.
Exactly right. I was just going to say that. Exactly right.
One phrase we've heard you talk about is societal design principles versus engineering design principles. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, look, what's wrong with the statement, move fast and break things, is bad. I mean, it was a great engineering design principle. We should, fix code and iterate fast. That's the way you should write code. But somehow that became how social engineering was done in some companies. And as I said, as hackers, we started saying, move fast and break things, even if on the other side it's somebody's financial health we're managing, or actual health, or their learning capabilities, and that's not okay. I don't think it's okay to do experiments on other humans to see like how do you optimize your own business objectives. That's effectively what that mindset of building companies meant. And I just think going away from how we think about MVP, which is all about growth and engagement and traction, to what's actually minimum virtuous product in the context of what you're trying to build there, we have to embrace that. I think the companies that embrace that are the ones that are winning today, and the companies that didn't get there. Look at Gusto and Zenefits. Look at Airbnb of the past and Airbnb today. The 21st century company vision that Brian has. I mean, he transformed it. He started in that era, and like look at what he does today. So, even Facebook has changed their line to move fast and create lasting impact or something like that, right? So it's the good news is in our industry, because data and AI gives us feedback loops so fast. We did lots of damage in 10 years, and we're learning from it, and hopefully we'll get on the right track. Is the way I think about it. Can you try to picture the first internal combustion engine, right? If somebody had told you it's going to electrify and you're going to have, transportation redefined, it's going to create climate change. If we knew that in the first 10 years, what we have done differently, maybe it would have been electric cars from the beginning. There would be no, Tesla, because that was the debate at that time, right? Instead, we didn't find out for 120 years, and then we're set in our ways, and we're still, spent 50 years debating if there's climate change. So I think tech has the opportunity not fall into that kind of a pattern, because if we're rigorously and data driven, we should learn from this and just say, okay, how are we going to change so that we can build more durable companies?
And is there anything that separates the best company cultures from the average company cultures in this area, or any tips you'd have for founders who are really out to foster this kind of culture?
Look, as I was saying, like true focus on mission and values, building, a team that brings the right sort of diverse points of views, but embraces those mission and values. Like that's where it starts, right? And it's very easy to say now that I think about it, because we're trying to build ourselves as a platform as well. It's very hard to execute, and I admire the founders that do it. It's not easy, and. The framework we laid out in intended consequences is meant to be, hey, for every part of company building, here are some things to be thinking about, that tie back to your mission values. And so I think that consistency is really important. And the other thing I would say is the best founders are really disciplined. If capital is easy to get, they'll raise it. Doesn't mean they'll change their spending habits. They care less about what the competitors are doing and more about their own belief system. In these really big markets, you care less about how do I get majority share, because you just never will. You focus on like, how do I serve my customers to the fullest, and what really is the physics of my business and how fast should I grow versus growth at all costs. I mean, I think these are all, being first principled and true to your mission will really set the cadence for how to build a winning company in your category, right? I mean, it's
a great point, because some of this is aspirational, meaning the minute you set a goal, in one sense, you can be held accountable to it, but they're not easy, and there's multiple fronts in this, right? And I guess you have to, as a founder, have the courage to set the goals and measure them, even if sometimes you fall short on the way.
Yeah, I also think that, one of the things that Hemant hit on is sort of these founders and who are they? And I think if you look at Gen Z founders, so much of them want to build companies that are much more about doing the right thing, not just building for the sake of building. I think we read some research recently about how concerned Gen Z is about the climate. And if you ask a Gen Xer or, even a millennial, probably not as concerned as a Gen Zer is, because they're going to be living with some of these consequences that
it's interesting you say that. So Nico, who leads our consumer work here, and Prateek, he's like all obsessed with Gen Zers. And when we were rolling out responsible innovation internally, one of his feedback was like, well, that's not really a phrase that the Gen Zers can relate to. So we would sort of unpack to say, well, what do the Gen Zers actually care about? And I think it was exactly what you just said. They are they care very much about the topics we're talking about right now, including climate and sustainability and sort of diversity. And I'm optimistic that positive change comes as generations sort of see what's not working, and then they hang together and stand for something. And I do think I have high hopes that this Gen Z community will do it well, and frankly will be the one shaping the Web3 crypto work too, which gives me a lot of confidence, because I do think that again can be weaponized in a multitude of bad ways. After all, today, like, greed is the killer app in crypto, when I sort of look at what's going on. And I know that'll change, but that's where things are. And I think this generation will hopefully put it on the right path.
And how about areas you're excited about? You talked about healthcare, you talked a little bit about defense, et cetera, but what are sort of the places you're spending some time in and that you're...
Look, when I look at my investing time, probably all my outbound time is really focused on the healthcare work and how do we create synergies across the great set of companies we're working with to actually make a difference versus just having good investments. This sort of, and activating this sort of collective synergy is like a big focus for me. Inbound, I'm always looking for great founders in any market. I think you know this. I'm pretty generalist in that regard. I think weaponizing decentralization is super interesting. Weaponizing biology with software is super interesting. I think transformation in the industry markets. My partner Ken cares a lot about workforce transformation. I think that's a huge theme that technology is necessitating. And then I think geographically, I'm very interested in India. I am a big believer that the time has come now, and we just spent 3 weeks there as we were talking, and it's amazing what's happening there. And I think we'll learn much from there and bring it here, just like what happened with China as well. So yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of areas to focus on. The key is, figure out how to focus.
Is there any topic that you want to hit on that we didn't talk about? Okay, wonderful. Well, Hemant, thank you so much for the time. It was really inspiring. And as a last parting question, what advice would you have for founders who are trying to build responsible businesses?
I hope, folks see that what I'm really trying to say is we haven't weaponized responsible innovation enough. I think if we bring that level of intentionality in company building and play the long game, we will actually end up having more impact, feel a real sense of purpose, and frankly, optimize returns. I mean, I often get questioned, you get to say this today because you've invested in a lot of successful companies and now you can, just be talking about responsible innovation. And that's really not true for me. And I reflected back on the last 20 years. My first investment was back in Chris Dixon on building a, safe search company. Because when you walk in the streets of Harlem, it's dangerous. When you walk on Fifth Avenue, it's not dangerous. On the web, you don't know what's safe, what's not. And we're like, wow, let's create a safer web. And my successes and failures all came from that mindset. So I deeply believe it. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, as the era of company building is changing to these bigger ideas with much greater responsibility, we should call it out. I mean, we should embrace that responsibility and not make it somebody else's problem with carnage at the expense of our success. That is the key to enduring, and I hope at least we start to talk more about that as a technology diaspora.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. It's inspiring.
Great, terrific.